June 14th, 1800. He had split his army that morning, sent his best general south, scattered his divisions across 40 miles of Italian countryside, chasing a battle that wasn't there. And now, in the middle of the afternoon, with 30,000 Austrians grinding his 22,000 men backward through smoke and dust and June heat, Napoleon Bonaparte understood with a clarity that only disaster provides exactly what he had done. The enemy he had been hunting was not retreating. It had been waiting, and it had found him first. He was 30 years old. He was the most dangerous military mind in Europe. He was losing. The Austrian artillery had been working since 9 in the morning. 30 guns, firing in coordinated volleys across a flat, open farmland with nowhere to hide. The smoke hung in the still air above the plain. Somewhere in that smoke, the Austrian infantry was walking forward with the slow, satisfied confidence of men who had already measured the distance to the finish line and found it comfortable. Napoleon was riding back and forth in front of his retreating infantry, not running, not shouting, not showing the one thing that would end the battle faster than any Austrian gun. The one thing he could not afford to show. He was buying time. He had sent a courier south to find Desai. Come back. Everything depends on it. But Desai was miles away on a road Napoleon himself had ordered him to take. And the courier had left less than an hour ago. And no one could say how far south Desai had marched before he heard the guns, or whether he had heard them, or whether he had turned around. The army was losing. And the only man who might stop that had been sent in the wrong direction by the man losing it. This is not the story of a brilliant trap. This is the story of a disaster that came within 30 minutes of ending the Napoleonic era before it truly began. And it starts not on June 14th, but in November of the year before, in a room where Napoleon Bonaparte nearly got shouted out of history. France in 1799 was a country that had survived 10 years of controlled emergency and was now beginning to ask when the emergency would end. The revolution had executed a king, buried half a generation in its wars, invented the guillotine as a tool of political management, and produced from its chaos a military that was unlike anything Europe had ever faced. Not an army of professional soldiers trained over decades in the refined tactics of cabinet warfare. Something rawer than that. Men who had learned to fight by fighting. Officers who had earned their commands in the field rather than inherited them at court. A force shaped by urgency and belief. Capable of a speed and aggression that older armies found difficult to match and impossible to fully predict. But by 1799, France had won battles. It had not won peace. Britain sat on the sea like a lid on a pot, its navy strangling French commerce from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Austria held northern Italy, the prize that mattered most, the theater where French ambition had burned brightest. Russia had joined the coalition. The gains of Napoleon's first Italian campaign, the stunning sequence of victories in 1796 and 1797 that had made a Corsican-born 27-year-old into the most famous soldier in Europe, were being reversed. Austrian forces had swept back through the peninsula. The French grip on Italy was slipping. And then, Napoleon came back from Egypt. The Egyptian expedition had been a strategic failure from the moment the British destroyed his fleet at the Battle of the Nile. His army was stranded. The campaign had no path forward. Napoleon recognized this before anyone forced him to, took a fast ship, outran the British blockade by speed and weather, and arrived in France in October 1799, with his reputation intact despite leaving his army behind. He arrived, specifically, at the moment when France's government was hated by nearly everyone and trusted by no one. The Directory, the five-man executive body that had governed France since 1795, was too corrupt for idealists, too unstable for conservatives, too expensive for citizens, too weak for the military. It was a structure held together by inertia and exhaustion, waiting for someone to push it. Napoleon pushed. The coup of 18 Brumaire lasted 2 days and very nearly failed on the second one. Napoleon was surrounded in the hall of the Council of the 500. Deputies screamed at him, grabbed his coat, pressed so close that he had to be physically dragged out by his own guards. He stood in the courtyard, pale, still, while inside the hall, his political future was being decided by the people trying to prevent it. What saved him was his brother Lucien, who was presiding over the session, and who stepped outside onto the steps and told the military guard, with a composure bordering on the theatrical, that the deputies had just attempted to assassinate his brother. The guards cleared the hall at bayonet point. The compliant deputies were reassembled elsewhere. A new government was proclaimed. It was done. Messily, but done. Napoleon became first consul of France, technically the head of a three-man executive. In practice, the government, the army, the state, and the only source of legitimacy a state built by coup could claim. But that legitimacy was entirely conditional, and the condition was simple. He had to produce results. He had to end the wars. Not with France defeated. That was unthinkable. With France victorious enough to impose a peace that could be sold to a country that had been at war for almost a decade. A peace that made the violence worth it. To get that peace, he had to destroy the Austrian army in Italy. And to do that, he had to get there first. Michael von Melas was 71 years old and had been a soldier for 50 of them. He was not a genius. He did not claim to be. He was a professional, which is a different thing, and in many situations, a more dangerous one. 50 years of Habsburg military service had given him something no amount of natural talent replaces. The specific knowledge of what works, acquired at the cost of watching what doesn't. He commanded the Austrian army in northern Italy, with approximately 100,000 men spread across the theater, and 30,000 concentrated in the operational zone around Alessandria. He had been pressing the French back for months, and by the spring of 1800, he was engaged in what appeared to be the final act of the campaign, the siege of Genoa, the last significant French position on the Italian coast, held by General Massena against a blockade so complete that the garrison had eaten through its horses and was beginning on the leather. Melas had no particular reason to expect Napoleon. The Alpine passes were snow-covered. The settled professional opinion of every general in the theater, Habsburg and British alike, was that a major French force could not cross the Alps in spring. That opinion was based on sound reasoning. The passes were narrow, the altitude brutal, the weather unpredictable. The logistical requirements for moving an army of that size through mountain terrain in May effectively prohibitive. It was not the assessment of men who were being lazy. It was the assessment of experienced officers who understood the problem. Napoleon was assembling 40,000 soldiers in Dijon under the cover designation of a training formation, secretly equipping them for a crossing no one thought possible. Artillery pieces were dismantled, packed into hollowed pine trunks, and dragged by mules up passes where the snow was still chest-deep. Horses were walked along ledges above 1,000-foot drops. Men carried what could not be dragged and dragged what could not be carried, moving upward through the cold with the slow, collective stubbornness of an army that had been told, not quite in these words, that on the other side of this mountain was the thing that would end the war. The Great St. Bernard Pass, May 1800, one of the most audacious movements in military history. And it worked exactly as Napoleon intended. He emerged into the Po Valley, not in front of Melas's army, but behind it. The Austrians, oriented west and south toward the coast, suddenly had a major French force between them and their line of communication with Austria. Every calculation Melas had made about the campaign had to be reconsidered from scratch. But the crossing that placed Napoleon behind the Austrian army also created the problem that would nearly destroy him. He was behind the enemy, but he did not know exactly where the enemy was. He knew Melas was somewhere in the region. He did not know whether Melas would move east, retreat south, or turn and fight. And without knowing, he began to do what any commander does when facing uncertainty across a wide operational area. He distributed his forces to cover the possibilities. He sent des Arcs south. He sent detachments east. He spread his army across 40 miles of the Po Valley, trying to be everywhere the Austrians might go. He was, in his own mind, being thorough. He was, in fact, handing the initiative to a 71-year-old general he had just assumed was looking for a way out. On June 4th, Genoa fell. The French garrison, out of ammunition and out of food, surrendered after 60 days. Massena's men marched out with honors of war, emaciated and proud. And with the fall of Genoa, Melas's strategic situation transformed entirely. The siege was over. His forces were free to concentrate. And concentrate they did, moving toward Alessandria, gathering everything available, preparing not to retreat, but to attack. Napoleon's cavalry screens and informant networks gave him a picture of an Austrian army still processing the siege's end, still dispersed, still deciding what to do next. The picture was wrong. On the evening of June 13th, 1800, Napoleon issued his orders for the following day. Des Arcs, commanding approximately 6,000 men, was sent south toward Rivalta to block what Napoleon believed would be an Austrian retreat toward Genoa. La Poipe was sent north. Other detachments were distributed. Napoleon's own force at Marengo when morning came, approximately 22,000 men. 30,000 Austrians were on the other side of the Bormida River. They had been moving into attack position since before midnight. Napoleon did not know. Before dawn, the air over the Bormida River was still. The plain of Marengo is not dramatic terrain. No mountains visible from the battlefield. No ridges or forests to anchor a line or conceal a movement. It is flat Italian farmland, plowed fields and irrigation ditches, and scattered farmhouses with thick walls. Rows of Lombardy poplars breaking the horizon without hiding it. In June, the heat arrives before the sun fully clears the hills to the east. And by midday, it sits on the plain like a physical weight. The heavy, still heat of the Po Valley that makes every movement expensive and every pause feel like an invitation to die in place. On the western bank of the Bormida, Melas had assembled 3 columns through the night. 30,000 men, 30 guns. They had been in position since before first light, waiting for the order that came as the sky began to pale in the east. On the French side, the morning opened quietly. Napoleon's cavalry pushed forward at first light toward Marengo village in a routine reconnaissance. They found a thin Austrian cavalry screen, a few hundred horsemen holding a line, responsive but not aggressive. When pressed, they gave ground. Napoleon read this as confirmation of what he had suspected. The Austrians were withdrawing. The light screen, the apparent passivity, the absence of any indication of a large, concentrated force on the far bank. It all pointed toward an enemy in the process of organizing a retreat. He was wrong, and he had less than 3 hours before the scale of that wrongness became impossible to deny. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the Austrian army crossed the Bormida River. Not a probe, not a feint. 3 columns, moving in coordinated sequence across the bridges and fords, the infantry first, then 30 guns unlimbered and positioned forward, then more infantry, then cavalry fanning the flanks. The French outpost at Marengo village took the first blow. General Victor's corps, holding the forward position, absorbed the initial Austrian assault with the grim professional stubbornness of soldiers who have been surprised and know it and respond not with panic, but with the determination to make the surprise as expensive as possible. The village changed hands inside the first hour. The French fell back to the next position. The Austrian artillery began its work. Word reached Napoleon at his farmhouse headquarters with the compressed urgency of a report that has been simplified by the man writing it, because he knows there is no time for full sentences. The Austrians were not retreating. They were attacking. In force. Now. Napoleon read it standing. He understood immediately. He sent a courier south with a single instruction. Come back. Come now. Everything depends on it. Then he rode toward the guns. The first 3 hours of the Battle of Marengo were not a battle so much as an equation being solved in real time, and the answer was coming out wrong. Victor's corps held. That needs to be said without softening. The men who absorbed the Austrian assault since 9 in the morning were not broken. They were compressed, pushed back through Marengo village, and then past it. But they maintained their cohesion, their unit structures, their ability to present a fighting front to an enemy that outnumbered them substantially. This is harder than it sounds. Soldiers who are losing ground have every rational incentive to stop presenting a fighting front and start running. Victor's men did not run. They gave space grudgingly, buying minutes with each position before retreating to the next. And those minutes were the only currency Napoleon had left. He fed in Lannes's corps to extend the left. He committed the consular guard to stiffen the center. He was not passive. He was constantly adjusting, plugging gaps, redirecting units, doing everything an active commander does when the only tool available is management of a deteriorating situation. But the mathematics of the afternoon were working against him with a patience that had no interest in his activity. 30 Austrian guns against fewer French pieces. Volleys walking back and forth across infantry formations with no cover and no way to escape the fire except by moving. Moving meant giving ground. Giving ground compressed the line. Compressing the line made the French formations denser targets. Denser targets meant more casualties per volley. More casualties per volley meant the line contracted further. The arithmetic ran in one direction only. By midday, the French had retreated 2 miles from their morning position. By early afternoon, they were still moving. Napoleon had committed everything. The consular guard was in the fight. Victor's corps was 6 hours into a battle, and running on the specific, diminishing reserve that experienced soldiers carry into their 7th hour of combat before it runs out entirely. Lannes was holding the left through personal presence, riding his line, visible to his men, using his body as a command instrument because he had nothing else to give them. 2 French cavalry charges against the Austrian flanks had been repulsed. The situation was not catastrophic. The word yet was doing very heavy work. There was no word from Desai. Napoleon showed nothing. Witnesses who were there describe him as calm during the retreat. And it is worth being precise about what kind of calm it was, not the false calm of a man suppressing panic with effort. The working calm of a mind still running through possibilities, still searching for the leverage point that changes the equation, refusing to accept that the search is over, even when every position on the field suggests it should be. He rode where the fighting was thickest. He appeared at the moments when French units were on the edge of giving way, and the appearance of the first consul at a breaking point had a documented effect. Men held who might otherwise have gone, not because of speeches, because they could see him, and he was not running. He had no way to know if he had enough left to buy. Then, at some point in the early afternoon, Melas did something that would seem, from inside his own certainty, like the reasonable decision of an old man who had earned his rest. He handed command to his subordinate, General Zach, and retired to Alessandria to recover from the day's exertions and a minor wound from a spent musket ball. He had been in the saddle since before midnight. He was 71 years old. He had just directed the assault that had pushed the French back 2 miles and was still pushing. He believed the battle was won. He was not wrong about the current situation. He was wrong about the next hour. And because he was wrong, he handed that next hour to a subordinate who would not be ready for what arrived inside it. Desai was 2 years older than Napoleon, and in almost every way his opposite in temperament. Where Napoleon filled rooms with energy, projecting authority like heat from a furnace, Desai was quiet, steady in the specific way that veteran soldiers recognize and trust, the steadiness of a man who does not perform competence, but simply has it, whose presence in a difficult situation produces not inspiration, but something more durable. The sense that the situation has been seen accurately and will be managed without drama. Napoleon had given him command of Upper Egypt during the Egyptian campaign, the vast, poorly supplied southern portion of the expedition, and Desai had managed it with the independence of a commander who knows how to make decisions when there is no headquarters to appeal to. Napoleon trusted him completely, which was why, on the morning of June 14th, he was miles to the south when the Austrian army crossed the Bormida River. By mid-morning, Desai's column was moving through flat farmland toward Rivalta. Routine march, hot morning, men covering ground with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers whose bodies have been trained to the task, thinking about water, about shade, about when they would stop. Then the artillery started. Sound moves differently across flat terrain. In the Po Valley, with no topography to interrupt or absorb it, cannon fire from Marengo traveled south with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Desai heard it from miles away. It was not scattered. It was not irregular. It was continuous, volley following volley with only the briefest pause between. The signature of a major engagement measured not in hundreds of men, but in thousands. He stopped the column. He listened. The battle was behind him, too large to be a skirmish, too sustained to be a rearguard exchange. Whatever was happening to the north was not the minor blocking action the morning had promised. He turned the column around. The courier from Napoleon arrived around midday, with an order confirming what Desai had already decided. Come back immediately. The situation is serious. Desai was already marching. This matters because it reveals something about how battles are actually won, not only by the man at the top who holds the plan, but by the subordinates at the edges who can hear that the plan is wrong and respond before they are told to. He had approximately 6,000 men. With him was a young artillery commander named Auguste Marmont, with a battery of 8 guns still limbered and ready for action after a morning of marching rather than fighting. They were moving north as fast as 6,000 men can move in June heat on Italian roads. The question was whether the French army would still exist as a coherent fighting force when they arrived. Back on the plain, the retreat continued. The French army was not routing. This distinction matters enormously, and it is the distinction that made everything that followed possible. Routing means unit cohesion has dissolved, means men have stopped thinking as soldiers and started thinking as individuals, means the army has become a crowd, moving away from something rather than a force moving between positions. The French army at Marengo in the mid-afternoon of June 14th was retreating, which is different. Units that had held their positions for hours were now moving backward, yielding ground with the exhausted grudge of men who have given everything asked of them and are now discovering the asking is not finished. Victor's corps was approaching its limit. 6 hours in action, ammunition running low, casualties significant. The Austrian infantry pressing their front was fresher in the relative sense that matters on a battlefield. Not fresh, but less depleted. And the Austrian cavalry on the flanks was beginning to find the gaps that open in every retreating line, when the men holding it have been fighting since morning. Lannes was on the left, doing what Lannes always did when the situation was worst, making himself visible at the point of maximum danger, riding his line, present everywhere his men might be wavering, using his physical presence as the only reserve he had left to give. The consular guard held the rear in square, unbroken, the anchor around which the retreat organized itself, the way a current finds the one stone in a riverbed that does not move. Napoleon was with them, in the smoke, in the heat, in the retreating current. No speeches, no theatrical gestures. What witnesses recorded was something more useful. The appearance of a man who had not accepted the result yet, who was still looking for the move that changed the equation, whose visible refusal to concede the afternoon gave his soldiers enough to calibrate against. Panic in command is contagious. Its absence is equally contagious. The army retreated. It did not rout. And the difference between those two things was the margin inside which everything else became possible. On the Austrian side, General Zach was watching with satisfaction. The French were going back. His infantry was following. His cavalry was fanning out on the flanks, looking for the moment the retreat accelerated into something he could convert into pursuit. He was calculating the size of his victory. He had been advancing since 9 in the morning, and the French were still going backward, and nothing in his field of vision suggested that anything was about to change. He was not looking south. His army had been advancing for 6 hours against organized resistance, and 6 hours of advancing scrambles formations. Units that had started the day in precise column had intermixed during the push. Artillery had outpaced infantry in some sectors. Cavalry was unevenly distributed. Zach's army at the moment of its apparent triumph was spread across 2 miles of farmland in a configuration built for pursuing a beaten enemy, not for receiving a fresh one. Nobody on the Austrian side was thinking about a fresh enemy. Nobody was looking south. Deszig's column came out of the south at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Napoleon, seeing the head of the column appear through the dust and the heat shimmer, reportedly said, "The battle is lost. There is still time to win another." The exact words vary by source. The substance does not. The battle of the morning was gone, its positions lost, its plan irretrievable. But the Austrian army had spent 6 hours walking forward in the Italian heat and was now strung out across 2 miles of open ground without flank protection on its left. And Desai had 6,000 men who had spent those same 6 hours marching on a road that, as it turned out, led directly to that unprotected flank. Napoleon and Deszig spoke quickly. The plan formed in minutes. Deszig would hit the Austrian front with his fresh infantry. Marmont would put his 8 guns on the Austrian left flank and open at close range. The French units, still in contact with the Austrian line, would halt their retreat and press forward when Deszig's attack began. And Kellerman, commanding a cavalry brigade of somewhere between 400 and 700 horsemen, would wait for what the guns created. Nobody told Kellerman what to do next. He watched Marmont's battery come into position on the southern flank of the Austrian column. He watched the first volleys go in. He watched the Austrian formation shudder under fire arriving from a direction it had not anticipated. Thousands of men turning to orient on the new threat, losing forward momentum, beginning the dangerous reorganization that leaves infantry exposed. He saw the gap open between the disordered column and its flanking support. He charged. No order, his judgment, his moment, his charge. Marmont's 8 guns fired into the left flank of the main Austrian column at close range. Flank fire against an infantry column does not work the way frontal fire does. A frontal volley hits the front ranks and works backward. Flank fire walks down the entire length of the formation simultaneously. Every rank is a target. Every man is in the killing zone. There is no safe position in the column, no depth to retreat into, no rank that is not reachable. The Austrian column, perhaps 6,000 men advancing in the confident, extended order of troops who believe they are pursuing a beaten enemy, took the flank fire without having formed square. Square was the answer to cavalry. Nobody had said cavalry was coming. Nobody had been looking south. Then the French infantry stopped retreating. Desai's men, 6,000 soldiers who had been marching since morning and had covered miles in June heat and were finally being pointed at something to do, hit the Austrian front with the compressed force of an impact that had been building all day and needed only direction. Desai led from the front, mounted, visible, at the position where a general positions himself when he has decided his presence is the most important thing he can contribute to the next 5 minutes. He was shot in the first moments of the charge. The bullet was not aimed at him specifically. In the smoke and noise of the assault, aimed fire at individuals was largely theoretical. He was simply where the fire was heaviest because he had put himself there, because that was where he believed he needed to be. He fell from his horse and died quickly, there in the dust of the Italian afternoon, without knowing that the attack was succeeding, without knowing that the Austrian column behind the smoke was already beginning to come apart, without knowing that the battle he had turned around to save was turning in the direction his men were running. He was 32 years old. He never knew he had won. Kellerman's cavalry went through the gap at approximately the same moment, or perhaps minutes later. The sequence is difficult to fix in a 15-minute period when everything changed at once. What is not difficult is the effect. Cavalry at the gallop into an infantry formation already disrupted by flank artillery and frontal assault. Without square formation, without the psychological preparation that allows men to stand firm when horses arrive at speed. The Austrian column broke, not bent, not compressed. Broke in the specific military sense, meaning unit cohesion dissolved, meaning the collective structure that keeps thousands of men acting as a force rather than a crowd collapsed inward, meaning what had been a military formation became individual men, making individual calculations about surviving the next 60 seconds. General Zach was captured in the collapse. His column lost more than 2,000 prisoners in under 30 minutes, in addition to the casualties of 6 hours of fighting. The Austrian advance stopped, reversed, became a retreat. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the army that had been winning the Battle of Marengo since 9 in the morning was withdrawing toward the Bormida River. Its formation broken, its commanding general a prisoner, the supporting columns behind it unable to respond quickly enough to a reversal that had taken 30 minutes to complete what 6 hours had been building toward. Napoleon rode through his advancing army. He had not yet been told that Desai was dead. Melas received the news in Alessandria. He had gone there to rest after handing Zach a won battle. He had been preparing his dispatch to Vienna, announcing the destruction of Napoleon's army of reserve, the reversal of the Italian campaign, the effective end of French ambitions on the peninsula. He was 71 years old. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours, and he believed, with every justification available to him, that the war in northern Italy was over. The first reports from the battlefield were fragmented. The situation had changed. Zach was a prisoner. The column had been struck in the flank. The advance had reversed. Melas understood immediately. He was old and exhausted, and he had just experienced the specific disaster from which no general fully recovers, believing he had won, and then learning he had not. He requested an armistice. The Convention of Alessandria was signed on June 15, 1800, the day after the battle. Austria would evacuate Piedmont, Lombardy, and the Ligurian coast. The Austrian army would withdraw east of the Mincio River. Every piece of territory the Second Coalition had spent 2 years recovering from French hands was surrendered in a single document, signed by a man who had thought, 24 hours earlier, that he was writing a victory dispatch. Napoleon sent word to Paris. The message was shaped, not falsified but shaped, in the way Napoleon would spend the next 15 years shaping his own history. The victory was complete. The campaign was concluded. Northern Italy was French. He was coming home. What the message did not contain was anything about the morning, the split forces, the 6 hours of losing. Desai arriving from the south, not according to a plan, but because he heard artillery and turned around. The official account that followed, cultivated in dispatches and commissions and the management of historical memory, presented Marengo as a brilliantly designed trap, a deliberate dispersal of force intended to lure the Austrians into overextension, followed by a decisive counterattack at the moment of maximum Austrian exposure. It was not a trap. It was a near catastrophe that became a victory in 30 minutes because a dead man turned around without orders and a cavalry officer charged without being told to. Napoleon knew this. He made sure posterity would not. Kellerman, who had seen the gap and gone through it and shattered the Austrian column and turned the battle, spent years trying to have this recognized. Napoleon's recorded response was precise. Kellerman made a good charge. I gave him the opportunity. The subordinate executed. The commander provided the conditions. The credit belongs to the vision. Kellerman knew what he had done. He said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. History, shaped by the man who controlled the narrative, was slow to agree. The Treaty of Luneville was signed on February 9, 1801. It was the formal peace between France and Austria that Marengo made inevitable. The diplomatic structure built on what June 14th had decided in the field. France received legal title to northern Italy, the left bank of the Rhine, formal recognition of its dominance over the satellite republics across the peninsula. Austria signed because a second French army under Moreau had confirmed at Hohenlinden in December 1800 what Marengo had established 6 months earlier. The Second Coalition was finished. The war that had been designed to roll back the French Revolution's gains ended with those gains not only intact, but extended. For Napoleon, Luneville was the political prize that Marengo made possible. With the major continental threat neutralized, he could build. The civil code, the legal framework that still underlies the law of France and much of continental Europe and its former colonies, was drafted in the years immediately following. The Concordat with Rome normalized the relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church after a decade of revolutionary hostility. The administrative infrastructure of the modern French state, the prefectural system, the reorganized judiciary, the rationalized finances, was constructed in the peace that Marengo purchased. The Peace of Amiens with Britain arrived in March 1802. For the first time since 1793, France and Britain were not at war. Napoleon used the peace to transform the consulate from a wartime emergency into something resembling permanent government. In August 1802, a plebiscite made him consul for life. In December 1804, a second plebiscite and a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris made him Emperor of the French. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The gesture was precise. The crown came from no bloodline, no divine tradition, no authority external to Napoleon himself. It came from the victories, and the first victory, the one that made all the others possible, the one that established that this man, who had seized power in a chaotic coup, could win the wars that justified that seizure, was Marengo. A morning that started with a mistake. An afternoon that produced a legend. The legend was durable because the man who built it controlled the sources. Napoleon wept when he was told Desailles was dead. Multiple witnesses recorded it, and there is no particular reason to doubt the grief was genuine. He said in the days after that Desailles was the only general he had who was irreplaceable. He may have meant it. He also managed the commemoration as he managed everything else. Desailles was honored. His name was put on the Arc de Triomphe. Statues were commissioned. But the framing of the honor preserved the narrative. Desailles was the brilliant subordinate who executed Napoleon's design. Not the man who turned around without orders, arrived at the exact moment the design had failed. The dead man could not argue with the version that was written. In the Piedmont in northern Italy, near the village that still bears the name Marengo, there is a farmhouse called the Cascina Bianca, the White Farmhouse. It stood on the battlefield on June 14th, 1800. Napoleon is said to have used its upper floor as an observation point during the battle, one of the positions from which he watched his army retreating and from which he watched, in the late afternoon, a column of men appear from the south and change everything. The farmhouse still stands. Its walls are from the period, stone that was there when the smoke hung over the plain, and the artillery worked in coordinated volleys, and 30,000 Austrians walked forward into what should have been the last chapter of the Napoleonic era. The plain around it is farmland now, as it has been for 2 centuries. In June it is planted with corn and wheat. The horizon is the same horizon, flat, broken only by the occasional line of poplars, with the Ligurian Apennines visible to the south on clear days. It is quiet in the specific way of flat agricultural land on a summer afternoon. A silence that does not announce itself, but simply is. There is no monument at the center of the battlefield. No preserved ground. No chain separating the site of the greatest reversal in Napoleon's career from the field surrounding it. You can drive across the battlefield without knowing it. The village still bears the name. In Alessandria, a few miles to the west, a small museum holds artifacts from the battle. Weapons, uniforms, the dry archaeology of a morning that nearly ended an empire. Every June there is a commemoration. Men come in consular guard uniforms and men come in Austrian white. Cannon fire at the appropriate hours, a ceremony at the place where Desailles is believed to have fallen. His name is on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, listed without distinction among the dead of the Revolutionary and Imperial Wars, adjacent to names far more famous and names entirely forgotten. Stone does not assign hierarchy. It holds all of them with equal weight. He turned around when he heard the guns. He was dead before it mattered. And the empire he saved lasted 15 more years before it fell at Waterloo. And the map of Europe that Marengo helped redraw was redrawn again at Vienna. And the man who had ridden back and forth in front of his retreating infantry on a June afternoon, buying minutes, he was not sure he had enough of spent the last 6 years of his life on a rock in the South Atlantic, dictating his memoirs, shaping the story even from exile, even from a place where there was no army and no state and nothing left to shape except history. The story said Marengo was planned. The ground knows different. The question Marengo leaves is not whether Napoleon was a genius. He was. This requires no argument. The question is, what kind of genius and what kind of leadership the word actually describes when you strip the myth down to what happened on a specific afternoon on a flat Italian plain. The myth says, a man who thinks 6 moves ahead, whose plans unfold with the precision of machinery, whose victories are products of design so complete that defeat is never a real possibility, only a position temporarily adopted to lure an enemy into a trap already prepared. The reality of June 14th, 1800 says something different and something more interesting. A man who made a serious intelligence error that morning, whose plan was wrong before 9 o'clock, who spent 6 hours watching the consequences of that error, grind his army backward across 2 miles of farmland, and who, during those 6 hours, never stopped functioning, never stopped adjusting, never showed his army the one thing that would have ended it faster than Austrian artillery, never accepted, as the rational evidence demanded he accept, that the afternoon was finished. The plan failed before noon. The man was still standing at 5 o'clock when Desai arrived. That is the actual genius of Marengo, not the crossing of the Alps, though that was extraordinary. Not the plan, because the plan was wrong. The genius was 6 hours of competent, controlled, visible leadership during a battle that was being lost, buying the minutes that a subordinate was unknowingly spending on his behalf on a road to the south. The genius was remaining functional when functioning required ignoring everything the situation was telling him about how it was going to end. Most people confronted with what Napoleon faced in the early afternoon of June 14th, a battle going catastrophically wrong, the consequences of failure existential, reinforcements absent, no certainty they were even coming, do one of two things. They collapse outward, which is visible and loud, or they collapse inward, which is quiet and fatal. The psychological withdrawal of a commander who has begun the work of assembling an explanation for what went wrong before the battle is actually over. Napoleon did neither. He stayed in the field, in the smoke, in the retreating current, until the battle turned. And then he took the story of that afternoon and shaped it into something that served his purposes. And then he fought the next battle. Whether that is admirable or troubling or some proportion of both is a question each viewer settles for themselves. History does not resolve it. The ground at Marengo does not resolve it. The farmhouse with the thick stone walls and the view of the flat plain does not resolve it. It only shows you what happened. A man made a mistake. An army held together anyway. A general turned around without orders when he heard the guns. A cavalry officer charged through a gap without being told to. The battle turned in 30 minutes, and in 30, the empire lasted 15 more years. Desai never knew. The ground remembers.